So Eileen Collins, a lot of Collinses, is deservedly the first of our honorees because Eileen is the first in many things. As I said before, the first woman to pilot the shuttle, the first woman to command the space flight. And prior to that, she was one of the first 2 women to become a test pilot in the Navy. And she flew in combat zones a decade before it was legal for women to serve in combat zones. And when she piloted a transport plane in Grenada during the 1983 invasion. Eileen flew 4 space missions and commanded the return to flight mission after the Columbia disaster. And when I asked her about the risks, when I talked to her prior to that mission, she compared the dangers of space travel to the risks that immigrants took in coming to America. And think about it. On her mother's side, her family came from Clare and Cork on her father's. And her ancestors didn't have an easy time of it. And she doesn't forget that. And coincidentally, when we spoke on Friday on the phone, she was volunteering at a food bank in San Antonio. She's here today with her son Luke and her husband Pat Youngs.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you, Patricia and Judy Collins, wherever you are. Oh my gosh, that was just beautiful, wonderful. I've always wanted to be a singer, but I could not sing. So another life, I decided to go fly. This is really great to be here. And I was asked to make about 5 minutes of comments, but before I do that, I do want to recognize again President Bill Clinton. He was the one that in 1993 signed the cooperative agreement with the Russians, which got the U.S. and Russia working together in the space program. And many, many cosmonauts have flown on the space shuttle. And in exchange, American astronauts flew on the Russian space station Mir, which allowed us to do long-duration flights on their space station before we built our own international space station. And he was responsible for that. And that was a little bit controversial that we were working with the former Soviet Union, which we actually were in a race with them to the moon back in the 1960s. And here we are in the 1990s, and now we're cooperating with the Russians. But it did work out, and we are very, very good friends with the Russians now at the engineers level, the flight controllers, the managers, the cosmonauts, the astronauts. It's been very successful, and now we're in the International Space Station. But I do want to say, I've got about 5 minutes, so I'm going to talk fast. I remember my uncle, Jim O'Hara. He was a writer. He had a beer in one hand and a cigarette in the other hand, and he'd be going like this, and he would talk, talk, talk. He had the gift of gab. And my mother had that also. But I want to say a few things about my Irish heritage and then a few things about the space program. So I am very, very proud of my Irish heritage, and I'm very lucky to be part of the Irish culture, and I consider the big Irish family. So my ancestors came to America in the mid-1800s. The Collins family settled in Ridgebury, Pennsylvania. They were farmers. And on my mother's side, the O'Haras, they were mostly railroad people. My grandfather, Jim O'Hara, was a manager at the Erie-Lackawanna station in Elmira, New York. So I grew up in Elmira, New York. And why does that matter? Well, Elmira is nearby Harris Hill, is known as the soaring capital of America. At one time, it was the soaring capital of the world, but that went to, I think, somewhere in Europe. So now we're the soaring capital of America and the site of the National Soaring Museum. So when I was a child, my dad would take us to the airport, the glider port. We'd sit on the hood of the car and we'd watch these gliders take off. And even at summer camp and all through the summer, I'd watch these gliders fly overhead. And I thought, I would really like to do that someday. I remember my mother taking us to the library. That's how she got rid of us, 4 kids, dump them off at the library, and she'd go do her shopping. But at the library, I found the section on flying, and I read everything I could find on flight. The theory of flight, the history of flight, women in aviation, military pilots, they all inspired me to eventually join the military. And by chance, my timing worked out. So the year that I graduated from Syracuse University, which was 1978, was the first year that the Air Force took women into pilot training. I reported to Vance Air Force Base in Enid, Oklahoma, and I was a member of the first class to take women into pilot training at that base. And there were only 4 of us, 4 women. And there were 280 male pilots and over 100 instructors. So everybody knew who we were, and they knew what kind of grades we were getting and how we were doing. Well, I will say that it was a test program, and it was very successful. They continued the program, and now women are pretty much integrated into flying in the Navy, in the Air Force, and in the Army. So there's so many stories. I could write a book. I don't have time, but I just want to share one story with you because I would like to tell something funny. So the women were walking around on the base with our green flight suits, and we looked very out of place. You know, there's a woman in a flight suit. And when they heard us talking on the radio, people thought, oh, there's a woman's voice on the radio. That was very unusual. So the first time I flew with Fort Worth Center, I was in formation. We fly a lead and a wingman. We fly around, both the lead and the wing talk on the radio. So when the Fort Worth Center flight controller, or air traffic controller, heard my voice, he called my lead and said, Vance 2-1 flight, is your wingman a wing woman? Or is his seatbelt just too tight? So I learned to have a sense of humor, and I never got upset about those things. I just kind of laughed. And anyway, so I flew in the Air Force for 12 years. It was wonderful. I absolutely loved the years that I did that. I met my husband, Pat, who's here with us today. He has just been great and very supportive throughout my career. But I started at NASA in 1990, 12 years after, I don't want to say actually left the Air Force, but the Air Force assigned me to NASA. So I left active Air Force flying, and now I'm going to someday fly the space shuttle. And I felt like I was leaving the best job in the world for the future best job in the world, because all I wanted to do when I was young is go farther and faster and higher. So I just want to say a few things about what it's like to be in space, because my Pat always tells me, just tell him what it's like to be in space and how much fun it is up there. Well, we work very, very hard, and the fun usually comes at the end of the mission. But the things I remember that are so wonderful about human spaceflight, and why I think that there will be tourism in space someday. It's going to be very successful. We got to get the cost down, and we've got to make it safer, but that will eventually happen with time. So being in space, you're floating in zero G. It's like learning how to roller skate for the first time, but it's a very wonderful, effortless feeling. Looking back at the Earth from space, you can put your face right up against the window and stretch out your arms, and you feel like you're a Greek god flying over the planet. Very cool. And the other thing is the feeling of success and teamwork that you get when you fly a successful mission. So I want to tell you a little bit about how my perspective of the Earth changed, because I used to be very focused on myself, and it was all about, you know, am I doing the right thing, and do I look right? And we live on a ball. Think about the fact that we live on a ball that is spinning. And the space station, by the way, and the space shuttle is only 200 miles above the surface. So if you could imagine yourself driving 200 miles down the road, take that distance and go up with it, that's only how high the space station is above the surface. It's not that far. If you drove straight there, it would take maybe 3 hours. So the breathable air goes up 2 to 3 miles. Airplanes fly 6 to 7 miles. If you're an Air Force pilot, you become an astronaut if you go to 50 miles. But the space station's at 200 miles. The Earth's atmosphere is like an apple skin on an apple. That's how thin it is when you look back. The other thing about being in space is the orbit. We go around the Earth once every 90 minutes. So that converts to, if you project it on the surface, 18,500 miles an hour. So you're hauling as you fly over we're in low Earth orbit. So if this is the Earth, we're going around like this. Every 90 minutes, we're going in and out of the shadow. So the sun's shining on the Earth, you get a sunset, and then 45 minutes later, a sunrise. 45 minutes later, a sunset. 45 minutes later, a sunrise. So you don't have normal nighttime up there like here on Earth. You sleep when it's dark usually. You get constant sun coming in and out of the windows every 45 minutes, so it kind of messes with your circadian rhythm. But it's so very different being in space. But someday, now we're in low Earth orbit. If you could fly straight there, you might get there in 3 hours. But if you're going to go to the moon, it takes 3 days. If you're going to go to Mars, it takes 6 months if the planets are on the same side of the sun. If the planets are on different sides of the sun, it takes 2 years. But we want to go to Mars someday. And I'll talk about that later, but you might ask the question, so why are we flying in space? So what does that do for us? Well, if you look at the history of the space program, space flight leads to invention, it leads to discoveries, it is exploration, and it's adventure. So we're adventuring into a new world. So as Patricia had mentioned, we think about the Irish people and even my ancestors who crossed the ocean so long ago, coming to a new world, and you think about how much courage that took. It took courage for them to leave their homes and their families, first of all. It took courage to get in a boat and go across an ocean. And it took courage to set up a new home in a place that maybe are you even going to be accepted where you're going. So I believe that the Irish people, particularly Irish Americans, are people of adventure. And I believe that our Irish ancestors have something in common with the space program, and that's the sense of adventure. So there's a need to explore, a need to learn new things, a need to do new things. And this is the hope of our space program, and it's the promise of our space program. So someday, people will leave planet Earth to explore new worlds. It will be under different circumstances, obviously, than the ocean travelers, but there will be many similarities because there's new worlds to discover, new technologies, new materials, and maybe even new life. Most of you know about the Kepler satellite. So the Kepler satellite was launched by NASA several years ago. The only purpose is to discover Earth-like planets in other parts of our galaxy. So to date, Kepler has identified 4,600 candidate planets, and of those, 1,040 are confirmed to be planets like Earth in the habitable zone of their stars. So I remember as a kid they told me there were 9 planets, and now we teach our kids that there's over 1,000, and the number changes all the time. It keeps going up. Kepler has only looked at a teeny bit of the sky in the galaxy. So if you extrapolate what we found to the entire galaxy, they're predicting that there's over 11 billion Earth-like planets. That doesn't even include the large ones. Someday, I believe, people will figure out a way to travel to these places. It won't be in my lifetime. Sometimes I wonder if maybe I was born too soon. I would just like to say it's really an honor to be here. My congratulations go to the other honorees. It's wonderful to meet you all and to be here with you. I want to thank Patricia again and all those who have went to a lot of hard work to put this event together. And I'm very proud to be Irish. God bless you all.